Hi, this is Bhavisha Sharma from Law School 101, and this video on statements assumptions, part 2 of critical reasoning, is brought to you by Law School 101 for all CLAT aspirants. The reasoning section comprises 40 marks of the entire paper, out of which anywhere from 5 to 25 questions can be asked from critical reasoning. A major subtopic in critical reasoning is formed by the statement assumption questions. These questions check the examinee's power to analyze a given statement and then find out what forms the backbone of any statement. To solve these questions, one must understand what exactly is an assumption. An assumption is the bedrock of any statement. It is the foundation on which any premise set up by the statement rests. Assumptions are implicit within the statement. If the assumption is falsified or invalidated, the entire argument falls like a house of cards. Let us take an example to understand it correctly. For instance, in the middle of a conversation with your friend, you tell her, "You should buy car A as it is cheaper." Now, assumption for the statement should be something that must be true in order to establish the truthfulness of the statement. So, as some of us can guess it, a valid assumption for this statement would be cheaper cars should be preferred. Because if cheaper cars must not be preferred, your argument of buying a car because it is cheaper will not hold true. It should be noted that this is definitely not the only assumption. In fact, each statement can have numerous assumptions. Remember this car example as I'll use it numerous times in the video to explain various concepts. How to identify an assumption? To identify an assumption, we use the falsification test. According to this, one must check each given option as if the validity of the premise lies on what the assumption is saying. We need to analyze the role the truthfulness of each statement has on establishing the validity of the statement. There can arise three cases. First, when the option is invalidating the premise set up by the statement. In this case, it is not a valid assumption. Second, when the premise set up by the statement is independent of the truthfulness or falsity of the option. In this case too, it is not a valid assumption. However, the third case, that is, when the truthfulness of a given option is absolutely essential for the premise set up by the statement to hold true, that option would be a legitimate and valid assumption. There are some simple rules that one must keep in mind while solving these questions. Such rules also come handy in eliminating options. Remember that the following rules do not show what or how an assumption should be. They are not a task for proving something as an assumption. On the other hand, these rules show what an assumption should not be and thus are helpful in eliminating options. Firstly, a given assumption can never have any external or extraneous knowledge, which is not given in the statement. An assumption is something that is implicit within the question and thus can never contain any new information. For instance, in the car example that we had earlier taken, any assumption that compares the mileage, looks, technology, etc. of car A, that is anything except its cost that was discussed in the statement, will not be a correct answer. Similarly, any assumption about any other car B would also not hold true. Secondly, and this is something that is obvious, an assumption can never be contrary to the statement. Keep in mind that assumptions are the foundational blocks of any statement and thus should propose the premise that the statement builds up. Any option that is contrary to what argument wants us to believe could be easily eliminated. This is also on the lines of the fact that any assumption that is contrary to the assumption that you have established to be correct will also be incorrect. Going back to the earlier example, an option that states that cheaper cars should not be preferred would definitely be eliminated as an incorrect option. Thirdly, Definite statements always have definite assumptions. This is self-explanatory and thus does not need any special attention. The last two slides that I have discussed are undoubtedly the most important part of the lesson. Let us recapitulate them. We use the falsification test to see whether a given option is a valid assumption. In this, a given option is a valid assumption only if the premise set up by the statement is totally dependent on the truthfulness of the given option. To eliminate incorrect options, we can check for three things. First, the option must not contain any new knowledge that has not been mentioned in the statement. Second, it must support the premise set up by the statement. And third, definite statements always have definite assumptions. Some of you might have realized that all these tests and methods are derived simply from the definition of assumptions. So once you understand the concept behind it, you will do all the tests and eliminations in your mind, and questions of such type will take up very less time. However, to reach that state, one needs to solve at least 100 questions of this type with due diligence while understanding all concepts. There is a requirement of discussion on some special kind of questions that are frequently recurring in CLAT exam. Here, I will tell you what assumptions are true in some frequently appearing questions so that you can solve them in less time with accuracy. The notice questions. In a question which talks about a notice being issued by an authority, it is universally assumed that A. People are literate and not blind, that is, people to whom the notice is addressed are well equipped to read it. B. People will adhere to the provisions of the notice. Advertisement questions. In questions where something is being advertised, it is universally assumed that A. Advertisement will lead to benefits in the form of better sales or more awareness to the advertiser. B. People will pay heed to the advertisement. C. Advertisement is done only by those media that have wide viewership. Warning questions. In warning questions related to breaking of a rule, it is assumed that A. Warning is issued only when there is a possibility of someone breaking the rule. B. Penalty imposed for breaking the rule is enough to deter people from flouting the norm. The dual negative assumptions. Assumptions that negate all clauses or the assumptions of which each clause is contradictory to its respective clause of the statement are not valid assumptions. This might sound a little complex, but let us understand this with an example. For instance, a statement says that smoking is injurious to health. An assumption that states that non-smoking improves health is not a valid assumption. It is just negating all the clauses that were set up by the statement, and it would not be a valid assumption even though some people might inaccurately think so. This is similar to the extra information rule. Just because we know what is unhealthy for health, we cannot make a judgment of what improves health. Questions entailing comparison. Questions that compare certain circumstances and the changes in them with time while attributing one concerning factor as a reason for change assume that all other factors remain unchanged or constant in the given time duration. For example, as shown, if the statement says Company A made lesser profits this year than last year, thus the prices of Company A's products fell down in this year. Analyzing the statement, we can understand that in this situation, the author is assuming that the other factors remain constant, as discussed in the assumptions shown on the screen of A and B. There are majorly two types of questions in statements and assumptions. The difference occurs in the length of the question. Type 1 is the kind that we have talked about in the video till now. As shown, these questions come with a given statement and many assumptions out of which none, one or many could be correct. The examinee is supposed to analyze all the given options after thoroughly reading the question and then determine which ones of the given are legitimate assumptions. You can also use the elimination method to eliminate the incorrect options. Type 2 is the kind that we will discuss in detail in upcoming slides. In such questions, you mostly have an entire paragraph to read and analyze, and then need to determine those assumptions that are relevant to the premise set up by the entire paragraph as a whole, and not by individual sentences. While type 2 sentences usually take up more time, they are generally more likely to be correct than type 1 questions, as the latter can be quite tricky, leading to negative marking. There can be various ways to approach this type of question. I'll come back later to this slide where I'll discuss how to solve these questions. Where I'll discuss how to solve this particular question as given on the slide. But now I'll discuss the way how to approach these questions in general. I'll discuss the way that I feel is most efficient and likely to be correct. While approaching these questions, read the paragraph once but with full concentration, laying importance on basic details. Understanding the paragraph's take on individual subtopics as well as the premise set up by the paragraph as a whole. After one diligent reading, start reading through the options. In each option, think whether this assumption is true or not by using the methods we have already discussed. Do not skip reading other assumptions if you think you have got your answer, but read all 4 assumptions before choosing the correct option, because in these questions there is a high possibility of 2 options being individually correct, but one being more appropriate or important for the premise of the paragraph, and thus that would be the correct answer. Let us try approaching the given question now. Going back to the last slide, let us read the question paragraph. The question says, the government is justified in spending hundreds of crores on producing cheap and subsidized computers. Let's start breaking it down. Note that the first statement of the paragraph sets the premise of the statement. Thus, the option that supports this premise would be a valid assumption. The next part of the paragraph discusses the reasoning for the premise. Because it is a well accepted fact that the future of learning, from learning in classrooms to learning about better crops and farming methods, to learning about the important developments around the world, is technology. Basically, with a lot of facts, in this statement, the importance of technology is highlighted. Furthermore, it will also help the poorer sections of the society in embracing the technological revolution going around the world. And this statement deals with the importance of technology on the poorer sections of the society. Now we have understood the paragraph, including the premise and the reasoning. Let us now read the assumptions one by one while analyzing them. First, learning isn't the sole prerogative of the elite. The statement nowhere talks about elites or their outlook towards education. Thus, this cannot be a valid assumption due to external information. Second, the costs incurred in producing cheap and subsidized computers would be at least partially recovered when poor start benefiting from using such devices. The statement nowhere talks about the costs that would be incurred in manufacturing cheap and subsidized computers. Thus, this option is also not valid assumption due to external knowledge. Third, the government is justified in spending on anything that will bring the poor in terms with the modern technology. The statement might be in accordance with the premise set up by the statement, but makes a very wide promise about anything, which is not mentioned in the statement. The statement is very specific, while the assumption is very wide in nature. Also, the truthfulness of the statement is not absolutely essential to prove the statement as true. Hence, this is not an appropriate assumption. Fourth, the poorer sections of the society do want to embrace the technological revolution going around the world. The main reasoning backing the premise is that the poorer sections will get to embrace the technological revolution going around the world. For this reasoning to hold ground, it is absolutely essential that the poorer sections are interested in embracing the technological revolution around the world. Thus, the fourth assumption is a valid assumption. Hence, the correct answer is D. I hope you all have understood the lesson. Ask your questions, watch our next video exclusively on past year paper questions on statement and assumptions. For more resources, please follow like, and share our page of Law School 101 on Facebook. Subscribe to our main YouTube channel by the same name. If you have any doubts, questions, or queries, post them in the comment section below. These will be replied to within reasonable time. All the very best.